What's up, teachers, and welcome back to video 2 in the series about executive function and how to help your students. And in this one, I'm going to help you understand executive function. And the last one, I helped you identify students who struggle with executive function in a very easy way. And this one, I'm going to help you really understand executive function. First thing I want to tell you is that I have a PDF for you. Go ahead and print that PDF. This PDF will give you a really great, easy checklist you can pin up to your wall in your classroom or in your office, and it will help lay out some of the aspects of executive function so that you can have a real clear idea of what those are in a real handy reference. And you can even use it to check off if you are looking at kids and trying to figure out what they're struggling with. It can help you pinpoint areas where you can help them. So first of all, I'm going to talk about where in the brain executive function happens. Then I'm going to talk about 10 aspects of executive function. Then I'm going to give you a quick tip with one of these aspects that you can implement today. That's a real easy win for these kids. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is what is going on in the brain. So firstly, a lot of people misunderstand executive function, teachers. A lot of parents and teachers misunderstand it, and what ends up happening is that we send the wrong messages to kids. So what happens is adults mistake the can't and the won't. Some adults will often think that it is a won't, that the student is being willful, that they're being lazy, that they're not motivated, that they're not disciplined, that they don't care about school, that they're not trying hard enough. Any of these stories that are based in a misunderstanding of executive function, rather than thinking that it's a can't. They legitimately can't. They do, if they have legitimate executive functions issues, they cannot do what we are asking them to do. They do not have these skills yet. Fortunately, the brain develops from the back forward, and the prefrontal cortex of the brain is where executive function takes place. The PFC, the prefrontal cortex, the front third, 30 or so percent of the brain is where executive function takes place, is the part of the brain that helps us to get things done. And our brains, their brains will continue to develop. The front part of the brain will continue to develop, fortunately, until these kids are 25 or 30 years old, which means that the better we can have effective interventions now, while their brains are in a fantastic place of development, the better off these kids are going to be, the better they're going to be able to have the future that they want to have, where they can accomplish the goals and the dreams that are important to them. So, again, executive function takes place in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. This is where these aspects that I'm about to mention to you generally are happening. So this is very complex. All of these aspects work together. So if it sounds like there's overlap, there is. It's all about overlap. Now, finally, as we get into the aspects now, the aspects of executive function have to do with execution. The reason it's called executive function is it's the functions of the brain that help you to execute complex tasks, like your lesson planning. When you are creating a lesson plan, that is a very complex task. It requires all of the things that I'm about to mention, and I'll be using the lesson planning example. Before I get into the aspects, I want to say something about the experts who talk about executive function. I love these people. They've contributed so much to our world. They bring great understanding to things. But when they describe the aspects of executive function, it is often in very clinical speak, very difficult to understand, and the experts are all over the place. I personally talk about 15 to 20 aspects, but a lot of the experts out there will say there are 3. Some will say there are 5. Some will say there are 8. So experts are all over the place. Don't worry about any disagreement between the experts. Worry about getting a vibe. I want you to walk away from this video with a vibe about what executive function is really all about. Aspect number 1 out of 10 that I'm going to talk about is focus, concentration, and attention. To me, they're synonymous. They're all the same thing. Focus, concentration, attention. If you want to do your lesson planning, you have to focus, concentrate, pay attention to the lesson planning in order to execute your task. There's a little twist about the lesson planning task in executive function, which I'll mention in a few moments. What is the opposite side of focus? If you are not focused, if you're not paying attention, if you're not concentrating, what word do we use for that? It is distraction or distractibility. So those are two sides of the same coin. For executive function, you have to be able to focus, pay attention, concentrate, avoid distractions, or do what's called inhibit distractions. Number 2, planning and time management. So if you are creating a lesson plan, you have to envision the lesson. You have to be able to think in a way where you can plan out the things that have to happen to make your lesson a success. You have to manage that time very carefully. You have to really be good at this. And for those of you teachers with weak executive function, you know what I'm talking about. It can be very hard to plan your lessons, and you always feel like you're not getting the lessons done. Those of you with very strong planning skills or executive function feel like you're able to accomplish your goals in terms of your lessons oftentimes. So these kids who struggle with executive function, they don't like planners. They don't want to use planners. They lose their planners. They don't really get planners. They don't get calendars. They don't get agendas. They don't get time. They have time blindness. So planning, the front part of the brain, helps you to plan, to think things through in a sequential way and make a plan. And these kids struggle with planning, which gets them into all kinds of trouble. Number 3 for aspects of executive function is organization. With organization, these kids often struggle to organize in 3 ways that I'm going to explain right now. One way is they struggle to organize things in space. That would be their backpacks, their folders, their lockers, their desks, their bedrooms. So those are things that we organize in space. So these are disorganized kids in terms of those things. If a kid looks organized, but you know they're not, we get a lot of those kids too. So these kids who their folders and their backpack appear organized, but they've really done that as a compensatory skill to get you off their back or get their parents off their back. But if you really were to pull out their folders and open them, you would see things in the wrong folders all the time, things upside down and backwards and crinkled. You would see that they often will pull out a notebook for any class. You'll say, get out your notebooks. They'll pull out their science notebook, even though they're in social studies, and they'll just write on any page. They won't be sequential about it. So these kids struggle with organization of things in space. They also struggle with organization of their thoughts. This is easily seen if you were a language arts teacher and you notice that your students who struggle with executive function, their writing goes all over the place. They struggle to organize their thoughts, and of course, they don't want to plan their papers. They don't want to do a good outline or brainstorm or whatever. They just want to dive all in, and they pay for it in the long run in terms of having to reorganize their papers after they've made a vomitous mass of ideas on their paper. And the next thing that these kids need to learn to organize, and you and I and parents can help them to organize this, is their digital world. These are the kids that don't get in good habits with knowing what portal to check, when, how, where the links are, where the passwords are. So they just, of course, they can find their digital stuff that's important to them. That's not an issue. But when it comes to dealing with an inbox or dealing with their portals and such, they often do not have good organization. So next thing, number 4, this isn't exactly an aspect of executive function, but it is a very important thing that is related to these kids who struggle with executive function, and that is advocacy. These kids are often not good at advocating for themselves. You say, hey, come meet me at lunch. I want to help you. They don't show up. They forget. They legitimately forgot. Hey, show up after school. I'll be there to help you. Hey, show up before school. They're not emailing you to say, hey, can you help me? Can we meet? You know, they're often afraid to ask for help. They've often had bad experiences where maybe they've had experiences in the past where they've said to a teacher, hey, what were you saying about that thing? I didn't catch that. And the teacher says, I already said it. I was very clear about what the details were. Well, the kid didn't get it. They didn't have the executive function or the attentional capabilities or the processing or whatever the case may be to get it. And they've had these negative experiences where they often associate asking for help as being just too uncomfortable to even try. Or they forget to ask for help. Either way, advocacy is number 4. And number 5 is self-monitoring. Being able to watch yourself and say, hey, I was doing this studying or this assignment and this worked for me and this didn't, so I'll do more of this and less of this. They're not monitoring. Am I on task? Am I off task? What would help me stay more on task? They're not connecting the dots. They're not self-monitoring. They don't have strong metacognition where they understand who they are as a thinker, how they feel, how they process the world. They can't articulate it very well. They are not very reflective. They are not very introspective. They are not very self-aware. Now, they may be very, very deep kids on some levels, but they're not self-aware when it comes to what they need to do to be able to execute, to be able to do the planning and organization and succeed in school. So they often struggle with those sorts of things: the self-awareness, the mindfulness, the self-consciousness, or being conscious of what they're doing, the metacognition, and the self-monitoring. Next is working memory. Number 6 is working memory, which is helping you stay on top of what you are thinking about in the moment. So if I were to ask you what's 163 plus 52, your working memory would help you juggle those numbers. The 1, the 6, the 3, the 5, the 2 would know that the 2 and the 3 were in the ones place. The 6 and the 5 were in the tens place. The 1 was in the hundreds place. So you'd be able to decompose those numbers. The working memory helps you to track things like that. But working memory also does a lot of other things. So if you were to say, hey, run to your locker and go grab your calculator right now. And the kid runs to their locker, they open their locker, and they're going, why was I here? I completely forget. The working memory is like juggling. It's juggling things in the moment that we need to keep track of. And these kids are often unprepared and struggle with all sorts of things related to working memory. Next one is emotional regulation. And this is a gigantic one. Learning, you and me and our kids, learning how to regulate emotion. These kids feel very intense emotions. You and I have learned to notch it down a bit, but these kids' life feels very intense to them. And they're learning how to regulate it, what to do with these very strong emotions. And this is a giant skill, and regulating emotion or emotional regulation is part of executive function. Executive function, the front part of our brain, helps us to regulate. And a lot of our kids struggle with regulating emotion. And some of the ones I worry about the most are the ones who struggle with emotional regulation and it's invisible. So kids who, they may be sitting in your class, everything looks just fine, but they're having a panic attack right in front of everybody and nobody can see it because it's invisible. So, or they're depressed, or they're angry, but they don't show it. You know, these kids where it's invisible, it makes it harder for us to see. And that's where we have to learn to, as you and I get better at our emotional regulation, we can then co-regulate and attune with kids better to detect some of the subtleties that come with these complex kids. Next, emotional regulation. The next is flexibility or pivoting. So pivoting, this is when we have to be flexible. We have to be able to change. If the bell rings, we have to pivot, grab our stuff, put it in our backpack, go to our locker, go to the next class, be ready for the next class to start, and be prepared. Or in the morning, when the alarm goes off, we have to wake up, and the students have to get out of bed. They have to get their stuff together, get on the bus, go to school. Pivoting or flexibility means that we are able to transition. And executive function helps us to move through a process of transition. And a lot of times these kids struggle with these transitions. And it can be really hard on them, even though we don't see it externally. This can be hard on them, again, to juggle all the things that they need to do. And number 9 has to do with tasks. When it comes to a student doing a task, you have to do 3 things. You have to start, you have to follow through, you have to finish. Task initiation is self-starting. These kids procrastinate, they're unmotivated, they're undisciplined or lazy. Those are not the truth, but those are the words that we use to describe difficulty with the skill or skills of self-starting. Task persistence is follow through, these kids following through. So maybe they start, but they don't follow through. And then finishing. Do they get their name on it? Do they get it turned in? Maybe they finish their work, but they don't get it turned in and they get a 0, even though they did it. So starting, follow through, and completion. And that's just that. That has to do with tasks. And number 10, finally, where I'm going to give you a quick tip on this one, is prioritization. These kids often have trouble prioritizing the right thing. They want to prioritize video games over your homework, or they want to prioritize what is more interesting or fun or engaging in the moment, and they often don't prioritize the things that are going to get them their long-term goals because their instant gratification wants them to prioritize the things that are more interesting in the moment. These kids, like I said, in the prefrontal cortex, this front part of the brain that's developing, these kids who struggle with priorities, one of the best things that I do that's an easy win for you that you can apply, and this is my little bonus tip right here. One of the things that I do that's very easy that you can do is ask the kids who struggle with executive function, what is your NOP, your number one priority today? Or what is your MIT, your most important thing today? If they're in study hall and you happen to be their study hall teacher too, you can walk up to them and be like, hey, what's your number one priority today? Because oftentimes they don't even know where to start. But that question is a very good question because they often can answer that question. And it suddenly takes this massive undone tasks that they know that they have to do that is overwhelming to them. And with their emotional regulation, it is very distracting to them. That question helps them solidify one most important thing that they can focus on. So you can ask them, what's your most important thing today? Cool. Do that right now. Start that right now. Or when are you going to start that? Where are you going to start that? How are you going to start that? So that is it for this video. Where in the brain does it take place? What are 10 aspects? This should have given you a good vibe for some of the aspects, regardless of how different experts break it down. All of these things work in conjunction with each other, like the spokes of a wheel, to help people execute tasks. So there is a lot of crossover and overlapping in these aspects. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how you can take action as a teacher. I'm going to talk about what you can do in your classroom. I'm going to talk about what you can do as far as grades are concerned and what you can do in terms of differentiation. My name is Seth Perler. Thank you for signing up for video 2 about understanding executive function. And please, if this helped you, share with your teacher friends, share on Facebook, give me thumbs up on my YouTube videos, subscribe on YouTube. Please help me get my work to more people so that we can all serve more kids who are struggling with executive function. And finally, again, thank you, teachers and administrators and professionals and therapists and anybody else who's watching this. Thank you for devoting your life to being in service of kids. We need you. You have the most important job in the world. These kids need you. Thank you for showing up in this lifetime in the way that you've chosen to do. Take care.